Hello, we are starting lecture 3 today. In lecture 3, we will look at various theories in terms of constraints as well as various assumptions and so on with respect to language learning in the domain of word learning. So, what do we actually need to start learning words? Till now we have seen the problems the child might face in terms of reference problem, in terms of extension problem. So, now we will look at what researchers have proposed with respect to taking care of various kinds of problems that the child might face. So, a number of theories based on different kinds of principles have been proposed. In terms of their points of departure, we will call them by different names. So, there are innate linguistic bias or properties. Similarly, there are non-linguistic factors, socio-pragmatic factors and attentional learning account, and then finally, we will look at syntactic bootstrapping. So, these are the main theories. Now, again due to paucity of time, we will be able to go through only the main aspects of these theories and also some amount of some evidence in favor and some evidence against the theories in order to give you a broad outlook about what each of the theories are all about. So, first and foremost we will talk about Markman's constraints, which is one of the most well known ones in terms of word acquisition. So, Markman talked about constraints. Now, what is a constraint? Constraint does not really mean kind of a limitation, but it is sort of a control in place, for example. So, then when they are learning words, they should not have the endless possible reference for a single word. There must be some sort of a control process put somewhere in order for them to understand how the word maps onto an object and thereby on a concept. So, we have already seen that the infants learn their first words around the age of 1 year plus minus a month or so. So, if measured by production, we talked about it in the previous lecture, that in terms of production, language word production happens a little later compared to the comprehension, which is attested by various findings all over the world. So, if we go by production, it is 1 year. If we go by comprehension, a little earlier, that is the time when children start to acquire words. Now, that is why the period between 12 months and 18 months sees a very rapid developmental shift. So, 1 year to 1.5 years, that is the phase, those 6 months is a very important developmental stage. So, babies must be utilizing some rules to justifying this naming explosion. That is how Markman calls it, naming explosion, because within those 6 months children learn to name a large number of words, large as in for their age. So, 50, 60, sometimes even 90 has been reported. So, the rate of acquisition of words would be impossible if they considered all possible hypotheses each time they encounter a novel word. This is what Markman says. So, there has to be some sort of a mechanism in place to minimize the number of possibilities. You cannot have a very large amount of possible reference. So, this is where he brings in the idea of a constraint. So, this was part of his 1994 very important publication. So, innate constraints, what do we mean by innate constraint? Before we go to the linguistically innate constraints in terms of language, before that let us understand what constraint is and where he borrowed this idea from. So, he says that this idea is taken from the domain of ethology, and they use it in the sense of a probabilistic bias that provide a good first guess. So, there out of let us say 20 possible reference for a particular candidate word, the constraint or the bias, probabilistic bias will reduce the number of possibilities to 5, let us say. So, that is what it means by providing a good first guess. So, first guess would be maybe one of these 2, one of these 3 kind of thing, rather than one out of 20. So, for example, this he quotes Gould and Muller's study in this on bees. So, foraging bees must learn the color of flower that gives a specific kind of a nectar. So, depending on the flower, the nectar's characteristic features change. So, the bees must learn which one gives what kind of nectar. So, as a result of which what they have found out is that purple is often the default value for them. So, purple is one of the first things that they will look for. So, in a field of flowers they will first go to purple, let us say. So, that is how the theory was put forward. So, it does not mean that the other colors flowers are do not have nectar, but given a choice they will always go to purple first and then try the other ones, which means learning the other values will take some time, will be different from the default ones, primarily because of the time that it takes, because if you already have some constraint in place, it helps to try that out in rather than the new ones out. So, that is the idea from where Markman has been inspired from. So, this idea in the background, he proposed linguistic constraints theory. We will call them linguistic constraint theory 1, because we have also another set of theories which we will call constraint theory 2. So, constraint theory came out in response to constraint theory 1 and the criticism that it faced. So, now since new words can potentially map onto any aspect of an event, are we innately biased to consider some meanings before others? That is what the innate constraints, that is innate linguistic constraints, talks about. Since there is a number of opportunities, is there some sort of a bias, some sort of a constraint that helps us narrow down. So, these constraints are particularly important in babies, because the lack of adequate syntactic knowledge will make it difficult for babies. So, for example, when we talked about Daniel Everett, so there he was trying to base whatever he is learning on his world knowledge, on his understanding of syntax of the world's languages and so on. There was something to fall back on, but babies do not have that. So, as a result of which constraints might be a very good source of, a very good potential source of information. So, in other words, are there any constraints that would put some limits on the possibilities? So, to take into account this idea, he has proposed 3 kinds of assumptions. These are called assumptions. Taxonomic assumption, whole word assumption and mutual exclusivity assumption. These 3 are part of his list of constraints. What does taxonomic assumption basically mean? It means that while extending the mapping of a word on a referent, the extension can happen only to the member of the same taxonomic group. You all know about taxonomy. It is always hierarchically organized. So, let us say a category called furniture. Within the category furniture, you have tables and you have chairs. Within chairs, again you have various kinds of chairs. So, starting from lab chair to office chair to study chair, and even the rocking chair, various kinds of chairs, similarly various kinds of tables. So, within that, each of these levels will be one particular layer of the taxonomic hierarchy. So, that is what it means. When the child learns a word, let us say the word for cat, then they will be able to extend the meaning of that word to all other members of the category cat, not going beyond the category, not going beyond the taxonomic hierarchy to all animals and various other kinds of possibilities. That is the taxonomic assumption. Then comes whole word assumption. So, learners should assume any new word refers to the entire object rather than its parts. So, when you are learning the word table, it refers to the entire table rather than its surface or the legs or whatever. Third one is the mutual exclusivity assumption. So, learners should assume that objects have only one name. So, as a result, if you have already learned the word table, now there is another word that comes in its vicinity, is used in the same time or in the same environment, then it should be taken as meaning referring to something else, maybe about the table or something that is happening around the table, some kind of a relation with the table or whatever, but not the table. That is mutual exclusivity. So, if you have already one word for one object, you are learning another word in a similar environment, then you should assume it refers to something else. So, that is the idea. So, let us break it down a little bit. So, taxonomic assumption basically refers to that labels are attached to the things of the same kind. So, object level to objects of the same kind, colors to similar kind of colors, action terms to similar kind of action terms, so on and so forth. In fact, children from 2.5 years to 3 years expect labels to refer to similar things. That is already a well known finding. So, the important question is, do children, when they are in that naming explosion phase, that is before 2 years, that is actually between 1 year and 1.5 years, that those 6 months when the naming explosion happens, do children actually utilize that kind of an assumption, which is what we see when they grow up. So, for that thing to be in place by 2.5 years, does it start during the naming explosion? That is the idea. So, are they utilizing the naming assumption or not? So, many experiments have been carried out. For example, one of the very first 1989, they showed that very young children tend to sort things taxonomically even in the absence of a label. That means, even in the absence of words, names, so to say. So, these children, the children in the study were really young, 16 to 31 months of age. Even the youngest one showed the ability to sort things in terms of taxonomic order. Another study by Markman and his colleague, they were looking at 3-year-old children. The procedure was like this. There were 2 phases in the experiment. The first phase where they were shown an object and then it was labeled with a novel word, not its actual name, but a novel word which the child does not know. For example, a picture of a cow and then they were told this is a dax. Now, dax is a non-word, it does not refer to anything, but in this case the novel word was paired with a known object with an object. Now, phase 2, half the children were asked to find another dax and other half of the children were asked to find another one. No labeling was given here. So, because the first phase they are given a label and the referent of that label. In the second phase they were asked a prompt question that they find me another dax. In the other case, the other group of children did not have that label, they were simply asked find me another one. What they found out was that before they were finding out, where will they find them out from? So, there was a list of things, there were number of objects from where they had to pick, they had to choose. So, those objects were they had thematically related objects as well as taxonomically related objects. So, the objects were already there, they did not have to find it out on their own, they are already given. So, thematically related, which means that for example, milk and grass etc., are thematically related to the object cow. That is why it is called thematically related, they are part of the entire gamut of understanding of being a cow. And on the other hand, they also had taxonomically related objects like pig. So, this is how the experiment went. The result was the children asked to find another dax were more likely to choose objects that were taxonomically related. For example, they chose pigs and other animals more often compared to those children who did not have the label mentioned in the question. So, this proved that children are biased to extend the new word to taxonomically related objects. That is taxonomical assumption. On the other hand, the second assumption is the whole word assumption, which means that during this naming explosion, children prefer to name or prefer to refer to whole objects. For example, one example that I have quoted here is from Woodward 1992. Babies were presented with 2 screens, one playing a dynamic substance, something like lava that was in motion. So, it is a substance, it is not an object. Objects are discrete, substances are not discrete. So, in this case they had given a substance in motion resembling lava. On the other screen they had a static object. Now, babies prefer to look at the substance, meaning the whole object is not salient. In this kind of a scenario, something that is moving as opposed to something that is static, it is just sitting there, which is an object, the child's attention was focused primarily on the moving substance, which meant that object without a label is not a salient thing in the environment. But in some trials, what they did was the babies heard a label and now they do not know what the label refers to. So, while they are watching those 2 things, those 2 displays, they heard something, they heard a name sort of a thing, and in this case they showed preference for the object, and this was taken as a proof for the baby's preference for objects, whole object, discrete entities when they hear a word. So, which means when you have a label, you prefer the whole object rather than a substance. Another study also found similar kind of result, even though they did not really start out looking for the same kind of evidence. Here their hypothesis was different. They wanted to check whether babies map labels on whatever is consistent in the environment. If something remains consistent, babies will focus on that rather than something that changes. So, to check that, they had two kinds of stimuli. One was consistent object with varying motion, let us say the lava, but it was moving in different kinds of configurations, or they had consistent motions with varying objects. So, the motion remained similar, but the objects kept changing. What they found out was that there was a developmental shift between 8 to 10 months to 13 to 15 months. So, in the initial phases, babies focused on whatever was consistent. So, be it movement or be it the object, whatever is consistent, they were focusing more on it. However, the older children tended to focus on whatever was whichever was the object. So, there was a shift of attention from consistent whatever is consistent to the object. So, this was taken as a proof for whole word assumption again. So, but there is a problem. If babies focus only on whole object, they might be at a disadvantage in learning parts of the object. How do you then tell them, how do you then teach them, or how do they learn the parts of an object after they have learned the whole object? Now, this was taken care of by the theory called mutual exclusivity assumption hypothesis, whatever. So, mutual exclusivity basically talks about that children prefer to stick to only one label for one object. So, one object, one name per object, that is the kind of a mapping they would prefer. So, if you have already have a name for an object like table, as I said, then the other words spoken in its presence will be referring to anything else but the table. So, there was an interesting experiment on this in 1988. 3-year-old children participated in this experiment. They were shown a pair of objects, one familiar and one unfamiliar one. They used something called a radish rosette maker. It is a sort of a tool that is used to make a rosette out of radish. So, that is an unfamiliar object for the children, but the cow is a familiar object. So, that is how they were shown one object that is known, another that is unknown, and they were asked to show me the fennel. Now, fennel is a noun word. So, of course, this is they wanted to check whether this will apply to the children will apply to cow or to the object, novel object. Children chose the novel object, obviously, because they probably know cow. So, if they already have the word for cow in their mind, they know that this is a cow. So, the novel object, word has to map onto the novel object. That is the, even if there is no reason or rhyme or reason as to why that should be called fennel, but because this is novel, the object is also novel. So, let us map them one to one, that is the idea. And this is taken as a proof for mutual exclusivity. Similarly, when shown a picture of a fish and asked which is dorsal fin, they pointed out the fin, not the fish. So, this experiment also they showed the fish, and the child already knows fish, and then they point out, is it the whole fish or is it this part which is the dorsal fin. Children correctly point out the fin because they already knew. So, these are the three assumptions that Markman has given, but there are other assumptions as well, for example, the shape bias and the function bias, the noun class bias and so on. So, the shape bias talks about that there is a bias for children to label objects of similar shapes with the same name. So, things that look similar will get the same name, that is the shape bias. The function bias talks about the bias with respect to function. So, the things with the same function will be called the same, right. So, noun bias talks about that there is a universal constraint that says children find nouns easier to learn compared to any other kinds of words, let us say verbs. So, that is why you see more number of nouns in the initial vocabulary of the children. That is a noun hypothesis, noun bias. And then lastly there is a pragmatic principle of conventionality and contrast. Conventionality, as the name suggests, that children assume that there is a conventional form which should be used in a language community, which is what you grow up learning. Children in a particular community will grow up learning that this is the convention of using this particular word, and this will be different from one community to another. Similarly, there is the idea of contrast, which both of these have been given by Clark in 2003 work. So, contrast talks about it is similar to mutual exclusivity. Any difference in form also means a difference in meaning, that is the idea. Now, all these different kinds of constraints have, though there are some proof, some experimental evidence for their existence, but there are also many criticisms. There are many. So, for example, the interpretation of the result itself has been discussed. So, for example, Markman and Hutchinson's results could also be interpreted in terms of the shape bias. Children tend to extend name to objects that share the general shape. So, what they talked about in terms of the the taxonomy or the whole word hypothesis, they could also be seen as a shape as an evidence of shape bias. Secondly, innate constraints may not work for all languages. For example, certain languages have for example, Korean and Japanese and other languages, children learn action words first more than nouns. So, it is very common for example, in Japanese it is very common to drop the noun. So, so only the verb could be used as a full sentence. For example, this is possible in Indian languages also. In Hindi you can say, rather than saying main ja raha hu is fine, you understand who is going, right. Or in Bangla, for example, you do not even need the raha hu part, you just simply say jachi. So, that already tells you who is doing the action of going. Similarly, in Japanese. So, as a result of which in this kind of languages verbs become more prominent compared to nouns, and as a result of which it is possible for children to learn verbs more than nouns in the initial phases of their life. Third point is, relying too much on constraints may actually hamper the child's understanding of words and concepts that match. For example, we have given a lot of examples of the dog and then the mother saying that this is a dog. So, for example, again we go back there. For example, a girl has a pet dog named say Bhim, and but the name Bhim does not preclude the child from understanding the word for animal. The same animal is Bhim, but it is also a dog, it is also a mammal, and so many other things. So, there should not, if we constrain the child from learning all the other labels for the same animal, then it is not going to help the child very well in the life, and that is not how children really grow up speaking. So, they do learn, which means there is an issue there. So, mutual exclusivity constraint as a result will put a constraint in the way for understanding these various layers of meaning. Every object can belong to various layers at the same time. So, the dog may be a pet dog, domesticated dog, it is also a member of the dog family, and so on and so forth. So, this was the first part, as I said, theory, constraints theory part 1. Now, this is where we come to the constraints theory 2. Now, this is also called developmental lexical principles framework. This was proposed in response to all the criticism that were raised against the constraint 1, Markman's constraints. So, this was proposed by a different group altogether in 1994. This framework proposed 6 principles of word learning. These are organized in 2 tiers. So, each tier has few principles, and then after the first tier of learning is over, the second tier gets activated, in some sense it gets activated. So, the 2 tiers, the tier 1 has principles that are proposed to be innate, and these are necessary for the first phase of word acquisition, and that is also the phase where children make a lot of errors. So, overextension, underextension, and all these various other problems are part of this phase of learning, and this is when they are basically sticking to the innate all those innate constraints. Once that phase is over, tier 2 takes up and this is where this tier is helpful in creating a refined and more sophisticated constraint, leading to less error. So, in the beginning they are trying with the basis of the innate constraints, and after that the second layer gets activated. So, tier 1 has these principles. the principle of reference. Reference we already know that words stand for objects. Principle of extendability, words do not necessarily refer to only one single object, it can extend to the members of the entire category and so on. Principle of object scope, words refer to object primarily, if not it applies to actions and events. So, the scope of the entire word. Then once that part is done, that part is understood and learnt, of course, children will make mistake, but then the fundamental things are in place, as somebody calls it, that they have the fundamental learning has been taken off, then they will be going for the second part, which is the more refined part. So, this is where they take care of all the errors, this is where they kind of fine tune the understanding. So, these principles again tier 2 also has principles, 3 principles. Principle of conventionality, this refers to the language specific properties. So, in one language, for example, in Korean, we have seen already that in Korean there is no direct mapping of concepts like in English in and on, rather they map it on in terms of tight fit and loose fit. So, that is conventionality. So, that is learned in tier 2. Then principle of categorical scope, perceptual similarity is no longer adequate. Now, children learn that words label taxonomic categories, first at a basic level and then at a superordinate level. And then of course, the novel name nameless category principle, children at this stage assume that a novel name refers to an object which does not yet have a name. So, whatever has a name we have taken care of, now a novel name comes in, now we have to that means it refers to a novel object. So, this is how this particular theory talks about the 2 tiers and how the 2 tiers function. Now, there are some supporting evidence as well as some contradicting evidence. We will look at the supporting evidence first. Now, this theory primarily takes care of 2 main issues. One is why children seem to obey the constraints while learning words. We have seen that they do obey those constraints. So, this theory says because they obey the constraints when they are in the tier 1, and then they are also capable of ignoring some constraints when they are in the tier 2. So, this theory takes care of both the possibilities. So, evidence from some innate universal biases have been reported. For example, English and Spanish children were tested on whether the difference in motion verb structure makes them behave differently. Now, what is motion verb? Motion verbs are those verbs that denote movement by maybe a human agent or by other agents, but movement in space. So, he entered the room versus he went inside the room. Now, in terms of canonical structure, in English and Spanish have different kinds of motion verb structure. English is a satellite frame language and Spanish is a verb frame language. Now, which means that in Spanish the main root verb of the motion verb denotes the path information, whereas in English the main verb denotes manner information. Now, this is something that the children grow up learning. What they wanted to check is this fundamental difference between these 2 languages, whether it has any impact on the way they pay attention to things, non-linguistic tasks. So, the results showed that they were sensitive to changes in both path and manner of motion. It is a very interesting experiment. The reference is given here, you can read for the entire story to know. But then we also have critics. There are some evidence against this theory. So, cross linguistic comparison showed that depending on language structure, children paid attention to certain aspects of the event. So, in the previous experiment we saw that irrespective of the language structure, they looked at the same thing, they were sensitive to the same kind of situation. The opposite view which comes from Choi et al.'s study on Korean versus English, they saw that the Korean children paid attention to tight fit, loose fit distinction, whereas English children did the opposite. So, in summary we can say that initial universal bias theory has both supporters and critics, and the debate is certainly not settled. However, in recent times there is a shift of attention from searching for bias, what kind of bias, whether it is universal or not, that kind of focus is not very strong anymore. Now, there is a new way of looking at the whole issue, and the focus has shifted to more general cognitive mechanisms, as in it may or may not be only language specific problem, it may be a part of the general purpose cognitive mechanism that the children have, all children have, and the way it develops across populations. So, with the learning language, learning words and being able to map the words on the concepts and the denotations might be part of the general all purpose cognitive mechanism. So, that is where the focus has somewhat shifted. Of course, the studies are going on still in linguistic bias, but a new domain has also opened up. So, we will discuss this development in the next lecture. Thank you.